The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles III sat in his private study, staring at the formal letter before him. The heavy cream paper bore the royal seal, but the words written upon it would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. His hands trembled slightly as he read the contents for the third time, each word cutting deeper than the last. Outside his window, London was awakening to what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday in March. Commuters hurried along the streets, tourists gathered near the palace gates, and life continued its normal rhythm. But inside these ancient walls, a storm was brewing that would change everything. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a nervous courier who had insisted on placing it directly into the king's hands. It came from Camilla's eldest son, Tom Parker Bowles, and contained allegations that Charles had never imagined he would face. The accusations were serious, involving financial improprieties and questionable business dealings that allegedly connected members of Camilla's extended family to several controversial international transactions. Charles removed his reading glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. At 75, he had faced many challenges in his long journey to the throne, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but now it felt crushing. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had navigated scandal and controversy with unwavering dignity. What would she have done in this situation? The door to his study opened quietly, and his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered with measured steps. The man's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern as he approached the king's desk. Behind him followed two other figures that Charles had been dreading to see, the head of royal protection and the palace's chief legal counsel. Their presence meant that what had begun as a family matter had now escalated to a matter of national security and constitutional importance. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began, his voice carefully controlled, "we have completed our preliminary investigation into the matter you brought to our attention. I'm afraid the findings are more serious than we initially hoped." Charles gestured for the men to sit, though he himself remained standing, gazing out at the garden where he and Camilla had shared so many peaceful moments. Those days now seemed like distant memories from another lifetime. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very gardens where they had planned their future together might now witness the destruction of everything they had built. The chief legal counsel opened a thick folder and began reading from documents that would forever change the trajectory of the monarchy. The evidence was damning, not necessarily against Camilla herself, but against several members of her immediate family who had apparently used their connection to the royal family for personal gain. There were business deals in the Middle East, property investments in questionable offshore accounts, and a web of financial relationships that could expose the monarchy to international scandal. "The concern, Your Majesty," the legal counsel continued, "is not just about the immediate family members involved, but about the potential for blackmail, foreign influence, and the security implications for the crown. Our intelligence services have briefed us that there are already whispers in certain international circles about these connections." Charles felt his world crumbling around him. He had fought for decades to be able to marry Camilla, facing public scrutiny, family disapproval, and constitutional challenges. Their love story had been one of persistence against all odds. And finally, when he became king, it seemed that their happiness was secured. But now, the very family he had embraced as his own threatened to bring down the institution he had sworn to protect. The head of royal protection spoke next, his words measured but urgent. "Sir, we have reason to believe that certain foreign entities have been monitoring these activities and may be preparing to use this information against the crown. The security implications extend beyond just reputation. There are genuine concerns about national security." As the morning wore on, more details emerged. Bank records, email communications, and surveillance reports painted a picture that Charles could no longer ignore. Tom Parker Bowles himself was not directly implicated, but his half-brother and several cousins had been involved in activities that could be seen as leveraging their royal connections for illegal purposes. The web extended to property deals in Dubai, art transactions in Switzerland, and consulting fees from companies with questionable backgrounds. The most devastating piece of evidence came in the form of recorded conversations, legally obtained through an ongoing investigation by international law enforcement. In these recordings, Camilla's family members could be heard explicitly discussing their ability to influence royal decisions and their access to sensitive information. Charles listened to the recordings with growing horror, recognizing voices of people he had welcomed into his home, people who had sat at his dinner table and called him family. By afternoon, the full scope of the situation had become clear. The palace faced an impossible choice. Either allow the investigation to continue and risk a public scandal that could damage the monarchy for generations, or take immediate action to distance the crown from the implicated individuals. But there was a third, more painful option that Charles had been avoiding. The possibility that Camilla herself might need to step back from her royal duties to protect the institution. Sir Clive presented the king with 3 different scenarios, each one more difficult than the last. The first involved a quiet investigation and gradual distancing from the problematic family members. The second required a complete severing of ties with Camilla's family and a public statement acknowledging the situation. The third was unthinkable, asking Camilla to choose between her family and her position as queen consort. Charles walked to his window again, watching the changing of the guard ceremony taking place in the distance. The precision, tradition, and unwavering dedication of those soldiers reminded him of his own duty to the crown and the British people. He had spent his entire life preparing for this role, and now he faced the possibility that his personal happiness might be incompatible with his constitutional obligations. The afternoon brought more troubling news. Intelligence sources had confirmed that at least 3 major international newspapers were preparing exposé articles about the royal family's connections to the questionable business dealings. The palace's media team estimated they had perhaps 48 hours before the story broke publicly. The decision could no longer be delayed. As evening approached, Charles made the most difficult phone call of his life. He dialed Camilla's private number, knowing that their conversation would change everything between them. She was at Raymill House, their private retreat in Wiltshire, unaware that her world was about to collapse. "Darling," her familiar voice came through the phone, warm and loving as always. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you until tomorrow. How was your day?" Charles struggled to find the words. How do you tell the person you love most in the world that their family's actions have put the monarchy in jeopardy? How do you explain that the very institution you've dedicated your life to serving now requires the ultimate sacrifice? "Camilla," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "we need to talk. Something has happened, and I need you to come to London immediately. I'm afraid it's quite serious." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Camilla had been married to Charles long enough to recognize the gravity in his voice. She had heard it only a few times before, when his mother died, when they faced the constitutional crisis surrounding their marriage, and now. "I'll leave right away," she said quietly. "Charles, whatever it is, we'll face it together. We always have." But, as Charles hung up the phone, he wondered if this time would be different. The documents spread across his desk told a story that couldn't be rewritten, and the choices ahead of them would test not just their marriage, but the very foundation of the modern monarchy. The palace staff had already begun preparing for what they privately called the most difficult royal decision in a generation. That night, as Charles sat alone in his study, he reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He had waited decades to become king, and now, less than 2 years into his reign, he faced a choice that could define his legacy forever. The crown had always demanded sacrifices, but this one felt particularly cruel. As midnight approached, and Camilla's car pulled through the palace gates, Charles prepared himself for a conversation that would change their lives forever. Camilla's heels echoed through the marble corridors of Clarence House as she hurried toward Charles's study, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. The urgent summons had left her mind spinning with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her behind those familiar oak doors. The palace staff she passed in the hallways averted their eyes, their usual warm greetings replaced by uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes. When she entered the study, she found Charles standing with his back to her, staring out at the darkened garden. The desk before him was covered with documents, files, and photographs that immediately caught her attention. Even from across the room, she could see official letterheads, legal documents, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. Her stomach dropped as the pieces began forming a terrifying picture. "Charles," she said softly, setting down her handbag and removing her coat with trembling hands. "What's all this about?" He turned slowly, and she saw in his face an expression she had never seen before, not just sadness or concern, but a deep, profound disappointment that cut her to the core. His eyes, usually so warm and loving when they looked at her, now held a distance that made her feel like a stranger in her own home. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. The formality of his tone sent chills down her spine. This wasn't her husband speaking to her. This was the king addressing a subject, and the distinction was terrifyingly clear. As she sat, Charles picked up a folder from his desk and opened it slowly, as if each movement caused him physical pain. 3 days ago, I received information about your family's business activities. Initially, I hoped it was a misunderstanding, perhaps malicious rumors designed to hurt us. But the investigation has revealed something far more serious. He handed her the first document, a bank statement showing large transfers of money between accounts linked to her family members and several offshore companies. Camilla's hands shook as she studied the numbers, recognizing her son Tom's account details alongside others she didn't immediately identify. I don't understand, she whispered, though deep down, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form. She had noticed Tom's sudden wealth over the past year, his new investments, and expensive purchases that seemed beyond his means as a food critic and author. She had asked him about it once, and he had mentioned some successful business ventures, but she hadn't pressed for details. Charles continued, his voice growing more strained with each revelation. Your family members have been using their connection to the royal family to facilitate business deals with questionable entities. There are property investments in Dubai funded by companies with links to arms dealing, art purchases in Switzerland that appear to be money laundering operations, and consulting fees from organizations that are under investigation by international law enforcement. The blood drained from Camilla's face as she read through document after document. Email exchanges between her stepson and foreign businessmen explicitly mentioned his mother's position as queen consort and suggested that access to royal events and information could be arranged for the right price. Phone transcripts revealed conversations about leveraging royal connections for business advantage, with specific mentions of state dinners and private royal gatherings being used as selling points for their services. This can't be real, Camilla said, her voice barely audible. Tom would never do this. He knows how hard we fought to be together, how much the monarchy means to you. He wouldn't risk everything we've built. But, even as she spoke the words, memories began surfacing that cast new shadows over recent events. Tom's sudden interest in attending royal functions he had previously avoided. His new circle of international friends who seemed more interested in his royal connections than his personality. The expensive gifts he had been giving family members, explained away as rewards for successful business ventures that he had been mysteriously vague about. Charles picked up another file, this one containing surveillance photographs. The images showed Tom and other family members meeting with individuals that intelligence services had identified as persons of interest in various international investigations. One photo showed him shaking hands with a man outside a London restaurant, money changing hands in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated transaction. The intelligence services have been monitoring some of these individuals for months as part of a broader investigation into international money laundering, Charles explained. Your family members weren't the target of the investigation, but they became entangled in it through their business relationships. Now their activities threaten to expose the monarchy to accusations of corruption and foreign influence. Camilla studied the photographs with growing horror, recognizing not just Tom but several of her other relatives. Her daughter Laura's husband was visible in one image, and even her sister Annabelle appeared in the background of another. The scope of the involvement was far broader than she could have imagined, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. How long has this been going on? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Our investigation suggests at least 18 months, possibly longer, Charles replied. It appears to have started small, perhaps with innocent networking and business opportunities. But it escalated quickly once the foreign entities realized the potential value of the royal connection. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. Camilla understood the constitutional monarchy well enough to know that any hint of corruption or foreign influence was potentially catastrophic. The crown's credibility depended on its absolute independence from commercial and political interests. Her family's actions hadn't just violated that principle, they had potentially compromised national security. What does this mean for us? She asked, though she already suspected the answer would destroy her world. Charles walked around the desk and sat beside her, taking her hands in his for what felt like the last time. The intelligence services believe there are already foreign governments aware of these connections. There's a risk of blackmail, manipulation, or worse. The palace's legal team has advised that we have perhaps hours before this becomes public knowledge. He paused, struggling with words that would change everything between them. Camilla, my darling, the crown must be protected above all else. You know this. We both swore to serve the institution before our own interests. Now that oath is being tested in the most painful way imaginable. She looked into his eyes and saw the answer to her question written in his expression. You want me to step back from my duties? It's not what I want, Charles said, his voice breaking. It's what the crown requires. Your family's actions have created a situation where your continued role as queen consort poses an unacceptable risk to the monarchy. The only way to protect the institution is to create distance between the crown and your family's activities. Camilla pulled her hands free and stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she had so often stood beside Charles, planning their future together. The garden outside looked the same, but everything else in her world had changed irrevocably. She thought about the years of struggle they had endured to be together, the public scrutiny, the constitutional challenges, and the final victory when Charles became king and she became his queen consort. All of it was crumbling because of family members who had betrayed not just her trust, but the trust of the nation. Have you spoken to Tom about this? She asked, turning back to face Charles. Not directly. The investigation is ongoing, and any contact with the involved parties could be seen as an attempt to influence or obstruct justice. The decision must be made based on the evidence we have, not on explanations that might never come. Camilla felt a surge of anger unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her family had not just destroyed their own lives, they had destroyed hers and Charles's as well. The selfishness and greed that had driven their actions would now cost her the position she had waited decades to hold, and the role she had come to cherish. How long do I have to decide? She asked, though she already knew there was really no decision to make. The crown's survival trumped personal happiness, and she had known this from the moment she agreed to marry Charles. The palace communications team needs to prepare statements by morning, Charles said quietly. The media investigation will break within 48 hours, and we need to be ahead of it. A voluntary stepping back from duties, presented as temporary while the investigation concludes, would be the best option for protecting the monarchy. The word temporary hung in the air between them, but both understood it was likely permanent. Public trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair, especially when it involved the royal family and international scandal. Even if Camilla were eventually cleared of any personal wrongdoing, her position would be forever tainted by her family's actions. As the night wore on, they discussed the practical implications of her stepping back, the constitutional arrangements, the public statements, the impact on their marriage, and the future of their relationship. Each decision felt like another nail in the coffin of the life they had built together. By dawn, the decision was made, and palace staff began preparing for what would become known as the most shocking royal announcement in modern history. The confrontation that would shatter Camilla's world forever began at 10 o'clock the following morning in the blue drawing room at Clarence House. She had spent the sleepless night preparing for this moment, gathering her courage for a conversation she had never imagined would be necessary. Across from her sat Tom Parker Bowles, her beloved son, fidgeting nervously with his cufflinks as palace security stood discreetly by the doors. Tom's usual confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew their secret had been discovered. He kept glancing at the documents spread across the coffee table between them, official papers bearing government seals and intelligence service letterheads that made the gravity of the situation undeniably clear. "Mom," Tom began, his voice cracking slightly. "I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like." Camilla studied her son's face, searching for the boy she had raised, the man she had been so proud of throughout his career as a food critic and author. Instead, she saw a stranger whose actions had potentially destroyed everything she had worked for, everything she and Charles had sacrificed to build together. "Then, please," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "explain to me how my son came to be involved in international money laundering schemes. Explain to me how your bank accounts show transfers from companies under investigation by law enforcement agencies in 3 different countries." Tom's face flushed red as he realized the extent of what his mother knew. He had clearly hoped that the evidence was incomplete, that he could somehow explain away or minimize his involvement. But the documents before them told a story that was impossible to deny or diminish. "It started innocently," he said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of desperation. "I was approached by some businessmen who were interested in investing in food and restaurant ventures. They said they were fans of my work, that they wanted to support British culinary culture. The money was good, and the opportunities seemed legitimate. Camilla picked up one of the phone transcripts and read aloud in a voice that grew colder with each word. According to this recording from 6 months ago, you told a potential client, and I quote, "Access to state dinners can be arranged through my mother's position. For the right investment in our ventures, doors that are normally closed can be opened." How do you explain that, Tom? The silence that followed was deafening. Tom's shoulders sagged as he realized that denial was no longer possible. The recorded evidence was irrefutable, captured through legal surveillance operations that had been monitoring his business associates for their suspected criminal activities. "I never thought it would go this far," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "At first, it was just networking, using connections that any family member might use. But then, they wanted more, and the money they offered was life-changing amounts, Mom. I thought I could control it, keep it limited to social introductions." Social introductions? Camilla's voice rose for the first time, her composure finally cracking. "Tom, you sold access to royal events. You promised these criminals that they could meet government officials, foreign dignitaries, and members of the royal family at private gatherings. You turned my position as queen consort into a commodity for sale to the highest bidder." She stood and walked to the window, her back to her son as she struggled to maintain her composure. Outside, life continued normally, but inside this room, a family was being torn apart by greed and betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to lose her position as queen consort because of the very family members she had hoped would benefit from her elevated status. "There's more," she continued, turning back to face Tom with documents in her hand. "Your business partners aren't just money launderers. Intelligence services have linked them to arms dealing, human trafficking, and terrorist financing. The money you accepted to arrange these introductions came from some of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world." Tom's face went white as the true scope of his involvement became clear. He had clearly believed he was dealing with wealthy businessmen engaged in questionable, but relatively harmless financial schemes. The reality that he had been used as a conduit for serious international criminals was obviously shocking to him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice pleading. "They never told me about any of that. I thought it was just tax avoidance schemes, maybe some regulatory arbitrage. I never imagined it was connected to terrorism or violence." "But you didn't ask questions either," Camilla replied sharply. "You accepted their money, you arranged their access, and you never once considered the implications for your family or for the crown. Your greed blinded you to the obvious red flags." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sir Clive Alderton entered with a grave expression, carrying additional files that Camilla dreaded to see. His presence meant that new information had emerged, and given the pattern of the last few days, it was unlikely to be good news. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Majesty," Sir Clive said, addressing Camilla with the formal title that might soon no longer apply. "But we've received additional intelligence that requires immediate attention. Mr. Parker Bowles's activities have had consequences beyond what we initially understood." He opened the new file and revealed photographs taken at various royal events over the past year. The images showed Tom introducing his business associates to other guests at state dinners, garden parties, and private receptions. In several photos, the criminals he had been working with could be seen in conversation with government ministers, foreign ambassadors, and senior civil servants. "Our security services have determined that sensitive information was compromised during these encounters," Sir Clive continued. "Details about government policy, diplomatic negotiations, and security arrangements were potentially accessed through these introductions. The breach of confidentiality extends far beyond financial corruption." Camilla sank back into her chair as the full scope of the disaster became clear. This wasn't just about money laundering or royal embarrassment. Her son's actions had potentially compromised national security, exposed government secrets, and endangered diplomatic relationships. The damage extended far beyond the royal family to the very foundations of British governance. Tom looked between his mother and Sir Clive with growing horror as he began to understand the true consequences of his actions. "I never asked for government information," he protested weakly. "I just made introductions at social events." "But you facilitated access to individuals who did seek that information," Sir Clive replied firmly. "Your business partners attended these events specifically to gather intelligence and establish compromising relationships with government officials. You were their entry point into circles they could never have accessed otherwise." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This was no longer just a royal scandal or family embarrassment. Tom's activities had potentially damaged British national interests and exposed classified information to hostile foreign entities. The security implications were staggering. "There's something else," Sir Clive continued, his voice heavy with regret. "We have evidence that your sister Laura and your stepfather's relatives have also been involved in these schemes. The network extends throughout your immediate family, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment." Camilla felt the last vestiges of hope drain away. She had clung to the possibility that Tom's involvement was an aberration, a single mistake that could be contained and managed. But the revelation that multiple family members were implicated meant that the damage was irreparable. The royal family's association with her entire family had been compromised. "How many people are we talking about?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "At least 6 members of your immediate and extended family," Sir Clive replied. "The investigation is ongoing, but the pattern of activity suggests this was a sophisticated operation that leveraged your position as Queen Consort to gain access to the highest levels of British society and government." As the morning wore on, more details emerged about the extent of the family's involvement in the criminal network. Financial records showed payments to multiple relatives. Social media posts documented their attendance at royal events alongside known criminals, and phone intercepts revealed conversations about leveraging royal connections for illegal purposes. By afternoon, it was clear that Camilla's stepping back from her duties was not just necessary, but inevitable. The scope of her family's betrayal made it impossible for her to continue as Queen Consort without compromising the entire monarchy. The institution that she had come to love and serve had been irreparably damaged by the very people she loved most. That evening, as Tom and the other implicated family members were escorted away for formal questioning by law enforcement agencies, Camilla sat alone in the room where her world had been destroyed. The woman who had fought for decades to earn her place beside the king now faced the reality that her family's greed had cost her everything she had worked for. The hardest part was knowing that there was no going back. Even if the criminal charges were eventually dropped or reduced, even if some family members were found to be less culpable than others, the damage to the crown's reputation was permanent. Public trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair, and Camilla understood that her association with the scandal would forever taint her position as Queen Consort. The emergency meeting in the palace's throne room was unlike anything the royal staff had ever experienced. Senior advisors, government officials, and security personnel filled the ornate chamber as King Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face etched with the weight of impossible decisions. The morning newspapers lay spread before him, their headlines screaming about royal scandal and constitutional crisis, though the full extent of the situation had not yet been revealed to the public. Sir Clive Alderton stood at the front of the room, presenting findings that grew more disturbing with each revelation. Behind him, large screens displayed flowcharts showing the complex web of financial transactions, photographs of royal events that had been compromised, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of unprecedented royal family involvement in international criminal activities. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began, his voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what he was reporting. "Our investigation has revealed that the security breach extends far beyond what we initially understood. The Queen Consort's family members have not only compromised royal events, but have also potentially exposed state secrets and endangered ongoing intelligence operations." The Prime Minister's representative, a stern woman from the Cabinet Office, leaned forward with obvious concern. "The implications for national security cannot be overstated. We have confirmed that at least 3 ongoing diplomatic negotiations have been compromised through information gathered at royal events. Foreign governments are already expressing concerns about information security at official British functions." Charles felt the weight of the crown more heavily than ever before. Each revelation made it clearer that this wasn't just a personal crisis, but a constitutional emergency that threatened the very foundations of the monarchy. The institution his mother had protected so carefully was now facing its greatest challenge since the abdication crisis of 1936. The head of palace security presented the next set of findings, his military bearing evident as he delivered devastating news. "Sir, we have identified at least 12 separate instances where classified information was discussed within earshot of the Queen Consort's family associates at official functions. These conversations included details about military deployments, intelligence operations, and sensitive diplomatic negotiations." A hush fell over the room as the implications sank in. The royal household had always been considered one of the most secure environments in the country, with strict protocols governing who could attend official functions and rigorous background checks for all attendees. The fact that these security measures had been circumvented through family connections represented a catastrophic failure of royal protection. There's more. The security chief continued grimly. We have evidence that some of the information gathered at these events has already been passed to hostile foreign intelligence services. At least 2 allied nations have expressed concerns about sharing sensitive information with British officials going forward. Charles closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his family's betrayal. This wasn't just about embarrassing headlines or political inconvenience. Camilla's family had potentially damaged Britain's relationships with its closest allies and compromised ongoing operations that protected British interests around the world. The palace's chief communications officer, a veteran of numerous royal crises, spoke next with obvious strain in her voice. Your Majesty, we estimate that we have perhaps 6 hours before the major newspapers publish their exposé pieces. The Guardian, The Times, and several international outlets have been investigating this story for weeks. Our ability to control the narrative is extremely limited. She clicked through to the next slide, showing draft headlines that would soon appear on front pages around the world. Royal family linked to international crime syndicate. Queen consort's family sold access to state secrets. And constitutional crisis as crown compromised by criminal network. Each headline was more damaging than the last, and Charles realized that no amount of careful public relations could minimize the impact of such revelations. The constitutional expert from the Cabinet Office stood to address the room, her legal background evident as she outlined the unprecedented nature of the crisis. Your Majesty, we are facing a situation without clear precedent in modern constitutional law. The Queen Consort's position is not merely ceremonial. She has access to state papers, attends Privy Council meetings, and is privy to sensitive government information. Her family's activities call into question the security of all these arrangements. She paused, clearly struggling with the gravity of her next words. The government's legal advisors believe that continuing the current arrangements while this investigation proceeds would be constitutionally untenable. The risk to national security is simply too great. Charles understood the implication immediately. It wasn't just about Camilla stepping back from public duties. It was about fundamentally restructuring her role within the constitutional framework. The Queen Consort position would need to be effectively suspended, potentially permanently, to protect the security of government operations. What are our options? Charles asked, though he dreaded the answer. The Attorney General's representative consulted his notes before responding. Sir, we see 3 possible courses of action. First, the Queen Consort could voluntarily step back from all official duties while maintaining her title, but with no access to state information or official functions. Second, she could formally renounce her position as Queen Consort while remaining married to Your Majesty in a private capacity. Third, there could be a formal separation that removes any constitutional questions about her status. The third option hung in the air like a death sentence. Charles had spent decades fighting to be able to marry Camilla, and now the very institution he served was requiring him to choose between his wife and his duty as king. The cruel irony was that their love story, which had finally triumphed over constitutional obstacles, was now being destroyed by constitutional necessities. The intelligence service briefing that followed painted an even darker picture. Your Majesty, the MI5 representative began, our investigation has revealed that this operation was specifically targeted at the royal family. The criminals involved didn't randomly encounter the Queen Consort's relatives. They systematically identified and cultivated relationships with them specifically to gain access to royal functions and government information. This revelation transformed the situation from a case of family greed gone wrong to a sophisticated intelligence operation against the British Crown. Camilla's family hadn't just been naive victims of criminal manipulation. They had been deliberately recruited and used as assets in what amounted to a state-sponsored intelligence operation. We believe the operation was coordinated by entities with connections to at least 2 hostile foreign governments, the intelligence officer continued. The ultimate goal appears to have been not just financial gain, but the systematic compromise of British government communications and decision-making processes. Charles felt sick as he realized the full scope of what had happened. His wife's family had been used as unwitting weapons against the very institution they were supposed to protect. The marriage that had brought him such happiness had become a vulnerability that enemies of Britain had exploited with devastating effectiveness. As the briefings continued throughout the afternoon, the picture became increasingly clear. This wasn't a scandal that would blow over with good public relations management. It was a fundamental compromise of royal security that would require years to fully understand and address. The damage to Britain's intelligence capabilities, diplomatic relationships, and constitutional arrangements would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. By evening, the decision-making process had moved beyond damage control to crisis management. The palace staff was already preparing for what they privately called the most significant constitutional change since the abdication, while government officials worked to assess and contain the security implications of the intelligence breach. The hardest part for Charles was knowing that Camilla was upstairs in their private quarters, packing her belongings and preparing to leave the life they had built together. The woman he had loved for decades was about to be erased from his official existence, not because their love had failed, but because her family's betrayal had made their union incompatible with his duty as king. As night fell over London, Charles faced the reality that the crown had once again demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The institution that had defined his entire life was requiring him to give up the person who had made that life meaningful. The boy who had dreamed of being king had never imagined that the crown would cost him everything he held dear. The palace, usually a place of tradition and stability, buzzed with the activity of constitutional crisis. Lawyers, security officials, and government representatives worked through the night to manage a situation that threatened not just the royal family, but the very foundations of British governance. In a few hours, the world would learn that the British monarchy was facing its greatest challenge in generations, and that the king would have to choose between his heart and his crown. The royal statement was released at precisely 9 o'clock on a grey Thursday morning, just as London was waking up to what would become the most shocking royal announcement in living memory. The BBC interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed special editions to print, and, within minutes, the world learned that Queen Consort Camilla was stepping back from all royal duties indefinitely due to what the palace described as serious security concerns related to her family's business activities. Charles stood alone in his study, watching the news coverage unfold on the television screen mounted discreetly in the corner. The same room where this nightmare had begun 3 days earlier now felt like a mausoleum of his former happiness. Outside his window, he could see the gathering crowds of photographers and reporters, their presence a stark reminder that his personal agony was now public entertainment. Camilla had left Clarence House at dawn, her departure coordinated by palace security to avoid the media circus that was already forming. She had wanted to say goodbye properly, but Charles had insisted on the clinical efficiency that the situation demanded. Any display of emotion would only fuel more speculation and make an impossible situation even more painful for both of them. The official statement, crafted by teams of lawyers and communications experts, told only a fraction of the true story. It spoke of irregularities in business relationships and potential security implications, carefully avoiding any mention of international criminal networks, compromised state secrets, or intelligence operations. The full truth would emerge eventually through court proceedings and investigative journalism. But, for now, the palace was managing the crisis one revelation at a time. Sir Clive Alderton entered the study with the morning's briefing papers, his face showing the strain of managing the most complex royal crisis in modern history. The overnight developments had brought new challenges as international allies sought reassurance about the security of their diplomatic relationships with Britain, and domestic politicians demanded answers about how such a massive security breach had been allowed to occur. Your Majesty, Sir Clive began carefully, we've received responses from the Prime Minister's office regarding the security review. All royal events will be subject to enhanced security protocols going forward, and there will be mandatory security clearance requirements for all family members attending official functions. The new measures were necessary, but painful reminders of how completely the traditional royal arrangements had been compromised. The easy, familial atmosphere that had characterized royal gatherings would be replaced by the paranoid security culture of a nation under threat. Charles realized that even if he eventually remarried, any future spouse would face scrutiny and restrictions that would make a normal family life nearly impossible. What about the criminal investigation? Charles asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The Metropolitan Police have made 3 arrests this morning, including Mr. Tom Parker Bowles and 2 of his associates. The Serious Fraud Office is coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to trace the full extent of the financial network. We estimate it could be months before we understand the complete scope of the operation. Charles nodded, trying to reconcile the image of Tom being led away in handcuffs with his memories of family dinners and shared laughter. The man who had called him stepfather with genuine affection was now facing serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. The family gatherings that had brought such joy to his later years would never happen again. The television coverage had moved to expert analysis, with constitutional scholars debating the implications of the crisis for the monarchy's future. Some argued that this scandal proved the need for fundamental reforms to royal security arrangements, while others suggested it demonstrated the inherent vulnerabilities of an institution that mixed family relationships with state functions. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Sir Clive continued with obvious reluctance. "We've received approaches from several media outlets requesting interviews with the Queen Consort about her perspective on these events. Her representatives have declined, but the pressure for her to make a public statement is likely to increase." Charles felt a surge of protective anger at the thought of Camilla being hounded by journalists seeking to profit from her pain. She had been as much a victim of her family's betrayal as anyone else, yet she would inevitably be portrayed as complicit or negligent in the media coverage that would follow. The woman who had spent years earning public acceptance would now see her reputation destroyed by actions she had known nothing about. "She is not to speak to anyone without palace approval," Charles said firmly. "Any statements will be coordinated through our communications team to ensure consistency with the ongoing investigation." But even as he spoke the words, Charles realized how hollow they sounded. Camilla was no longer part of the palace structure, no longer subject to royal protocols or protection. She was now a private citizen whose former status made her a target for media exploitation. The very institution that should protect her was now powerless to do so. The afternoon brought a meeting with the Privy Council, a gathering of senior government officials and royal advisors that felt more like a tribunal than a consultation. Charles faced questions about his own knowledge of his wife's family activities, his oversight of security arrangements at royal events, and his plans for preventing similar breaches in the future. "Your Majesty," the Lord President of the Council said carefully, "there are questions about the constitutional implications of this situation. Some legal scholars argue that the king's marriage to someone whose family has compromised state security creates ongoing vulnerabilities that cannot be resolved through security protocols alone." The implication was clear, though unspoken. As long as Charles remained married to Camilla, questions would persist about the security of royal arrangements and the possibility of further breaches. The institution was effectively demanding that he choose between his marriage and his throne, a choice that no constitutional document had ever explicitly required, but that political reality now made inevitable. "Are you suggesting that abdication is the only solution?" Charles asked, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We are suggesting that all options must be considered to restore confidence in the security of royal arrangements," the Lord President replied diplomatically. "The government has full confidence in Your Majesty's commitment to the crown, but the current situation creates uncertainties that may require difficult decisions." Charles understood that he was being given an ultimatum disguised as advice. The political establishment would support his reign only if he demonstrated that the crown's security took precedence over his personal relationships. The message was clear. Camilla had to be completely removed from his life, or his own position as king would become untenable. That evening, Charles sat alone in the same garden where he and Camilla had walked just days earlier, planning their future together. The spring flowers that had brought them such joy now seemed to mock the destruction of everything they had built. The cruel irony was that their love story, which had finally triumphed over decades of obstacles, was now ending not because their feelings had changed, but because external forces had made their union incompatible with his duties as king. The phone rang in his study, and Charles knew without answering that it would be Camilla calling from her exile at Raymell House. They had agreed to maintain minimal contact to avoid any appearance of ongoing security risks, but the formal distance between them felt like a betrayal of everything their relationship had meant. "How are you holding up?" her familiar voice asked when he finally answered the phone. "I should be asking you that question," Charles replied, grateful to hear her voice despite the pain it caused. "Are you safe? Do you have everything you need?" "I'm fine," she said, though he could hear the exhaustion and heartbreak in her voice. "Charles, I want you to know that I understand why this had to happen. I don't blame you for the choice you've made. The crown must come first. We've always known that. Her words, meant to comfort him, only deepened his anguish. She was absolving him of responsibility for a decision that was destroying both their lives, taking on the burden of guilt for her family's actions, while simultaneously accepting the loss of everything she had worked for as queen consort. "This isn't forever," Charles said, though they both knew it probably was. "When the investigation is complete, when the security concerns are resolved, perhaps we can find a way forward." But, even as he spoke the words, Charles knew they were false comfort. The damage to the crown's reputation was permanent, and public trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. Even if Camilla were completely exonerated of any wrongdoing, her association with the scandal would forever taint her position in the constitutional framework. They talked for another hour about practical matters, legal arrangements, and the mundane details of separating lives that had been intertwined for decades. It was the conversation of two people trying to manage an impossible situation with dignity and grace, even as their world collapsed around them. As Charles hung up the phone, he realized that he was facing the same choice that had confronted his great-uncle Edward VIII in 1936. Choose between the crown and the woman he loved. But, unlike Edward, who had chosen love over duty, Charles understood that his reign was needed by a nation facing unprecedented challenges. The crown required his service more than his happiness. The next morning would bring new revelations, more investigations, and continued crisis management. But, tonight, Charles sat alone in the palace that had been his home for decades, surrounded by the history and tradition that demanded he sacrifice his personal happiness for the greater good. The boy who had dreamed of being king had achieved his ambition, only to discover that the crown's weight was measured not in gold but in the pieces of his heart that it demanded in tribute. Outside his window, London continued its ancient rhythms, unaware that their king was learning the hardest lesson of constitutional monarchy, that the institution he served would always demand more than he was willing to give, and that the price of the crown was everything he held dear.